Hosea. Some of the historical background. This is after the death of Jeroboam II in 753 BC. The fortunes of the northern kingdom experienced a sharp decline, right? The life situation has really gone down. The nation entered a chaotic period filled with oppression, strife, and impiety, right? We read about. Hosea provides graphic documentation of the nation's sin, right? The kings were often drunken debauchery. Priests, rather than calling nation to righteousness, actually encouraged people in their sin and rebellion, right? So they started to worship Baal, golden calf. They were not trusting Yahweh. Everything has gone down. Very bad, right? Very bad. So this is the situation of Hosea's day. And here is a chart given there under various king, what was happening, right? Jeroboam II supported shrine at Bethel, contributed to exploitation of the poor by sponsoring high standard of living. And then you go how each and every king ruled, who prophesied, what was their wrong, the mistake, everything is there in the chart. And so it's good to look at what was happening. What else to look at? Yes, a little bit about the author. His name, like Joshua, simply means salvation, right? Hosea, Joshua, Isaiah, all comes from the same root, means salvation, right? Of course, he was a prophet to the northern kingdom, right? Amos and Hosea, two of them prophesied to the northern kingdom, right? Prophets of the northern kingdom, Israel. That's the main thing. Outline, God's judgment and deliverance of Israel is the theme, divided into two. First 3 chapters focuses on Hosea's marriage and family, right? And that explains the relationship of God with Israel. Chapter 4 to 14 lays aside the analogy of Hosea's marriage and family. So that's how it is. So 14 chapters are there. One of the biggest books in the Minor Prophets, in a way, 14 with the 14 chapters. And so that's the outline given there for you to look at. I want to go to the interpretive issues, right? First issue is talking about Judah, kings of Judah. The question here is asked, why Hosea mentions southern kingdom and its kings if his call was a ministry to the northern kingdom? If he was called to prophesy against the northern kingdom, why did he mention southern kingdom or kings? Of course, the kings of Judah are mentioned for maybe polemical reasons, right? For debates, in order to address the debate, not make the debate. Hosea apparently viewed kings of the northern kingdom as usurpers of the legitimate rule of the Davidic line in the southern kingdom. He believed these northern kings are people who disturb God's line, Davidic line of kings. Furthermore, with Amos, Hosea's call to the northern kingdom did not preclude his prophesying to the southern kingdom as well. So of course, he was prophesying to the northern kingdom. His foundation was in the southern kingdom, and that's the reason he included southern kings as well as in the prophecy. Now, the biggest interpretive issue is about Gomer. So you might have heard about Gomer. Who is she? Right. There are several questions that are raised regarding Hosea's marriage to Gomer. Several questions. Number one, was Gomer a real person? Was it a real person? Or is it some kind of figurative figure comparing to Israel? Second, was she a harlot? Was Gomer harlot? Third, in Gomer in chapter 1, is she the same person in chapter 3? How could holy God command his servant to marry an immoral woman if Gomer was a harlot? How can God do that? Ultimately, the question is whether to treat chapters 1 through 3 literal or not. That is the question. Some people argue against literal interpretation that is given here. Holy God would not command one of his prophets to marry immoral women. So it is no, this is not literal woman. Names of the 3 children are also symbolic, suggest that children as well as the marriage were intended to simply a literal device to assist communicating certain truth. So people say this is not literal. Children are not literal. God wants to communicate, tell something to Israel in the way of analogy. It's not a real person. Third, as such, Hosea family served to illustrate relationship between God and Israel. Yet, where the marriage and the children real, the actual time involved in having the children would have precluded the children from serving effectively as object lesson. By the time second child was born and named, significance of the first child would have been forgotten and so on. And so they were saying, no, it's not real marriage, no real children. Woman in chapter 3 appears to be a different woman than Gomer in chapter 1. That is their argument. In chapter 3, she's not named, and prophet must pay a price for her. This supports the position that the prophet is merely employing an artistic license in describing his wife and family and not intending the reader to understand these as actual people. So, this is one way of argument explaining book of Hosea as they're not real people. Gomer is not the real wife of Hosea. Now, arguments for literal interpretation. There is nothing in these chapters suggests that what is described is other than literal. There's nothing. Prophet does not employ obvious figures of speech. He clearly uses this as a real incident. There are no visions involved. There are no similes or parables in this passage to say that this is not real. Second, having children with a symbolic name, that also does not demand that children themselves are not real. For example, Isaiah, they had children with a symbolic name, right? Isaiah had, children born and with a symbolic meaning. And the time involved in having 3 children does not necessarily rule out children are used as object lessons. Because you have got 3 children, and when the second children come, first children will be forgotten. So they are not really children. It's all symbols. That is what their argument. That what literal interpreters say, no, having 3 children with object lesson is not necessary to be symbolic. Other prophets were engaged in object lesson extended over a long period of time. Right? So children are given, names are given to teach lessons. Author provides too many details in these chapters to conclude that this is simply literary devices. Too many details are given. So saying that this is not real people is a problematic. Now, what about the woman in chapter 1 and 3? Few differences noted between woman in chapter 3 and Gomer in chapter 1. Does not rule out the two being one and the same. Because Hosea 3 verse 1 can be translated. It says, go, love again your wife, though she is loved by another and is an adulteress. So the same analogy between God and his spouse and Hosea and his spouse is found in chapter 3 as in chapter 1. Since God has only one spouse, the conclusion is Hosea had only one spouse. It is the same Gomer in chapter 3. Some have suggested Gomer was a real, but she was guilty of spiritual immorality rather than actual harlotry. That's what some people say. However, this would not ease the tension. Would God be any less implicated had he directed his prophet to marry an idolater than a harlot? If Gomer was not really a harlot and her sin was idolatry, why not? God asked Hosea, hey, marry the idolater, not harlot. So that is also. So in addition, Hosea paying the price for the woman in chapter 3 argues for the woman being a harlot than an apostate. This woman is not simply a woman who was worshipping idols. It's not spiritual harlotry, but the real harlotry is what we are talking about. And then God is using that as an example to talk about the problem with Israel. So what is the conclusion? Conclusion is this. The evidence weighs in favor of interpreting chapters 1 through 3 literally. Literal interpretation. While not resolving moral tensions altogether, God asked Hosea to marry a harlot. It may be that Gomer was not immoral. Listen carefully. Gomer was not immoral until after Hosea married her. The expression wife of harlotry in one does not demand premarital unchastity. It can be used to describe one whose character lended itself to unfaithfulness without having actually engaged in such before marriage. So the analogy with Israel could be used to argue for post-marital immorality as well. That Israel, after having a relationship with the Yahweh, committing adultery now, like working against God. So Israel is frequently depicted in the prophets as a maiden whom God chooses and who afterward engages in idolatry. This is quite common in the prophetic books. That engaging in idolatry is committed, it's described there as a spiritual harlotry. So it is best to say that this is a literal woman, right? Gomer was a literal woman marrying, but later she indulged in harlotry to tell people that God is using me now. These are an illustration to talk about the relationship of Yahweh with Israel. The third interpretive problem we see happening, this is quoting in the New Testament, in Romans, right? Hosea chapter 1 verse 10 and 2 verse 23 is quoted in Romans chapter 9 verse 25. So let's look at what is in Romans 9:25. Open your Bibles to Romans chapter 9. 25 and 26.
As he says in Hosea, I will call them my people who are not my people, and I will call her my loved one who is not my loved one. And it will happen that in the very place where it was said to them, you are not my people, they will be called sons of the living God.
All right. So this is a quotation from Hosea. This is one of the several uses of the Old Testament in the New Testament that raises both hermeneutical and theological questions. Hosea apparently is describing in these verses God's future restoration of national Israel to a position of covenant favor, right? What Hosea is prophesying about? Restoration of Israel to their land. Paul, on the other hand, what he did, he ignored the Old Testament context and used now this passage to describe what? Salvation of Gentiles. Specifically, salvation of his readers as representatives of the church. Right? So that is what happened. There are three views on Paul's use of Hosea in this passage. So how do you understand? Hosea is talking about Jewish people. Paul is using that quotation to talk about the salvation of Gentiles in the church. How do you explain? Three ways people explain. Number one, amillennialist, post-millennialist, and historical premillennialist. They generally conclude that Paul reinterprets the Hosea passage and applies it directly to the church with the understanding that church fulfilled Hosea's prophecy, like Joe Gillard and other people. Church fulfills Old Testament prophecy. So it is fulfilled in the church. That is what most of the amillennialists and post-millennialists believe. Some dispensationalists and few non-dispensational also argue that Paul is simply applying the principle found in Hosea passage. That is, namely, God has mercy on those who are not his people. Yeah. That is, God saves those who are undeserving. Whether Jews in Hosea's time or Gentiles in Romans. So many people explain that way. The point of emphasis is not Jews or Gentiles. Point of emphasis is that in Hosea time, God was saved, in Hosea's prophecy, God is saving undeserved people, Jewish people. And Paul's time, undeserved Gentile people. So that is what the emphasis. Some people explain that way. Other dispensationalists hold that Paul is addressing in these verses not Gentiles, but Jews. In other words, Paul cited Hosea to support the concept either of God's present judgment of Jews or of his future salvation of Jews. So some people think, now Paul is here, even in the book of Romans, he's not talking about Gentiles, but he's talking about salvation of Jewish people and their judgment and salvation together. That is what some explain. The first view presents hermeneutical and theological problem that it make it unacceptable that church fulfilled Hosea's prophecy is no way, because that is coming from a theological baggage that church replaces Israel. So all the prophecy related to Israel now will fulfill in the church, right? That cannot be accepted. It concludes that Paul ignored the Old Testament context and meaning of Hosea and reinterpreted the passage in an attempt to bluster his argument. So that is what it says. I don't think that is a right way of understanding. Further, it assumes a connection between Israel and the church This is not clearly taught elsewhere in the scripture, right? Church replaces national Israel. That is a theology that comes from covenant theologies. Deciding between second and third view is difficult. Both can master evidence from the immediate context. The second view that Paul is citing in Hosea passage in principle to show that God has mercy on the undeserving here for Gentiles is consistent with Romans 9:24 and 9:30. Right. It is consistent with the context. What? God is showing mercy to the undeserving. So yes, in Hosea, talking about undeserving Jewish people, here undeserving Gentiles. That is consistent with the context. In these verses, salvation of Gentiles is specifically mentioned. Where? In verse 24 and 30. So that is the second view. The third view that Paul is citing Hosea to support either God's present judgment of the Jews or his future salvation of Jews could point to Romans 9:27 and 29. So the third view often emphasizes, or they look at verse 27 and 29, and they say, so it is not talking about undeserved people are undeserving. God is saving undeserving people. No. Paul is really talking about Jewish people alone. Because verse 27 and 28, Paul is using their Isaiah's passage. And it shows he's connected to the Jewish people. So these verses have been reinterpreted in defense of one or other approaches. Now, so it's hard to say, is second view is correct or third view is correct. So here is a balanced way of explaining. Although questions remain, second view is preferred over third. Hosea 1:10 and 2:23 appear to be the wrong verses to show God's judging the nation. Conversely, Romans 9 appears to be the wrong section in Romans 9-11 to support God's future salvation of national Israel. Yes, that is taken up in chapter 11 for sure, but not in chapter 9. If you look at chapter 9, the main argument is that undeserving people are elected to salvation is the main discussion. It may be added that Peter appears to use these verses in a similar to the second view, right, in other places. And so it may be in a Glennie distinguishes between typical and analogical fulfillment. The latter does not involve predictive prophecy in that sense of heightening its use, and the opt for typical fulfillment. So according to his criteria, analogical would seem to be better option. Yes, there are some people think that Paul is using Israel as an analogy to talk about the salvation of Gentiles. So that is some argument. So there is no clear-cut answer whether second view or third view is the right. There is no clear-cut. It's hard to say, but we think second view is maybe more logical in chapter 9. I wanted to look at one more verse, right? Not one more, there are a few more. Hosea 11 verse 1 and Matthew 2:50. Let's look at Hosea 11. This is a passage that we already discussed, but somehow we wanted to explain, maybe because we are in Hosea, we need to explain, right? Let's go to Matthew chapter 2, verse 15. Matthew 2:15. Can anyone read?
Where he stayed until the death of Herod, And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet. Out of Egypt, I call my son.
Out of Egypt, I call my son. That is the quotation from Hosea, chapter 11. Matthew is using, right, that passage to talk about Jesus' stay in Egypt and his coming back to Israel. So this is a similar problem to the above in Matthew and appears to reinterpret Hosea's passage. In 11 verse 1, the word son clearly refers to the nation Israel, right? When Hosea prophesied, out of Egypt, I called my son. This is talking about children of Israel from Egyptian slavery. God is delivering, right? That is what Hosea talks about. But in Matthew, the term clearly refers to not to Israel, but to Jesus, right? So, of course, you know that how covenant theologians would interpret this passage. They would interpret in different way. And of course, we already discussed about the idea of sense of linear, fuller sense. That means Hosea, when he prophesied, he did not understand the fuller sense of that one, but Matthew understood. That's as some people explain. Rather than seeing here support for some kind of sense of prayer, it is best to see Matthew employing the passage in an analogical or typical fashion, right? Using a passage as analogy, not really fulfilling the real fulfillment of the prophecy. For example, the passage does describe Israel in Hosea, and Matthew sees a typical relationship between Israel and Jesus that allows him to apply Hosea passage to Jesus. Right. Matthew sees Jesus as typifying, but an analogy for Israel. Both are referred to as God's son, right? If you look at Exodus chapter 4, God calls Israel as my son. And Matthew also, in Matthew also you will say, both are recipients of divine call. Both experience a sojourn in Egypt, followed by departure from Egypt to Palestine, right? Israel were in Egypt. Jesus was in Egypt. Israel was called out of Egypt. Jesus was called out of Egypt, right? All under the hand of God. Furthermore, the expression fulfill as used in Matthew and other ND writers had a broad semantic range to include the idea of typical relationship. So this is already been discussed in hermeneutics. So if you wanted to know more, go back to the discussion of the same discussion in the hermeneutics, how the word fulfilled is used in the New Testament. It's not all same way, not the same meaning. There are various ways the word fulfilled is used. All right, now we have one more passage, right? Maybe that's the last one. Yes, last one from this. That is 1 Corinthians 15:55. So let's look at that one. What is the issue here? Let's find out. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 55.
Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting?
All right. This is also quoted from Hosea. The issue with the citation is that Paul appears to be using this passage out of context. Again, passage in Hosea is found in a context where God is condemning the northern kingdom for failing to respond properly to covenantal chastisement, right? So God is condemning the Israel. Verses on both sides speaks of God's judgment. That is for sure, right? So Hosea is speaking about God's judgment. Paul, on the other hand, use this passage as a positive statement referring to the promise of resurrection. Resurrection. Hosea is speaking about judgment. Paul is talking about resurrection. So several questions need to be raised over this verse. First concerns the first two lines of the passage. Should these be taken as rhetorical questions with no answer is intended? Because in the passage we read, question is asked, where or death is your victory? Where or death is your sting? So this is a rhetorical question, right? So should this be translated as a rhetorical question only with a yes answer? Right, that is the first thing. Or should this be translated as declarations? No answer is expected. First of these options would present a negative statement that God is not going to deliver the nation from judgment. Second and third options take the statements in a positive way that God will intervene to deliver the nation from judgment. So, the second question involves lines 3 and 4. That is, are these to be taken suggesting death and Sheol have been robbed of their power? That is, as a statement of victory over death, or it should be viewed or taken as taunts inviting in effect death and the grave to exact their toll. Right? That is the debate here. Lastly, how should the last line of the verse be interpreted? Some take it in a positive sense in Hosea. Repentance is hidden from my sight. That is what we read in Hosea. The thought would be that God will not change his mind regarding the promises he made in the previous lines. So the majority, however, appear to take the verses in a negative sense of God withholding compassion for the nation. So what we are talking about is completely related to Hosea's passage. How Hosea's passage has to be interpreted. Now, ultimately, the issue is whether to take the entire verse as developing the thought of God's judgment in harmony with the surrounding verses, or as a parenthesis, holding out the hope of deliverance from judgment. How to take Hosea's passage? That is a question. Is it a reference to God's judgment, or that is connect with the context, or take out of context Hosea's passage and explain it as a verse for deliverance? How do you look at it? Paul's usage, it seems to demand the latter. Paul seems to be taking the passage not within the context, but taking the verse in a parenthesis. So if a verse is in parenthesis, it is not connected to the context, right? Because Paul is talking about deliverance, right? And since the verse can be interpreted in this manner, it is possible and it is a preferred interpretation. It should be noted that there are other examples of such abrupt changes from judgments to deliverance in the Old Testament and back to judgment again, like in Hosea passage, and other prophets that allow for such rapid transition as argued here. here in these verses. So what is happening? How do we look at that passage? Yes, the passage in the context in Hosea, it is talking about judgment. But it looks like the verse that Paul is quoting has to be viewed as a verse in parenthesis. As an author explains about the judgment, suddenly he gives a hope in between, a hope of deliverance. Looks like Paul looked at that passage in the context of judgment, a hope of deliverance. That's how Paul looked at it. And then Paul quotes that passage in 1 Corinthians. He wants to talk about deliverance, connecting resurrection. Resurrection, according to Paul, is a way of deliverance. And therefore, Paul asks, "O death, where is your victory?" Right? "O death, where is your sting?" Resurrection is there. So Paul is looking at that passage as a deliverance passage, not as a judgment passage.